one of the overlays that we found was extremely odd was that you couldn't get experience if the property was more than 50 miles away from your home office. So you took 3 out of a log of 500, and then you assumed that the rest of the 497 were just as good, right? You looked at one report. It might have been the best one, or it might have been the worst one.
If you're having a hard time kind of getting back on track with, with eating or budgeting or whatever, doing a real heavy push, kind of an intense push makes the follow-up, not seem nearly as bad.
And second quarter, 3% growth, the most growth we've seen in a quarter since, I think, October of 2024. Episode 52 of Market Moves with Mark and Jeff. Two uninteresting guys wasting away, but talking about interesting times. Back here, happy to be here, Jeff. We are on day 3 of the fast together that you and I talked about in the last episode. We'll talk about that maybe at the end of the show, provided we have enough energy to make it. I think our guest is likely going to provide that energy that you and I might be lacking.
Absolutely, Mark. Probably a good idea to give a faint warning if one of us just drops off, in mid-conversation. It may be, low blood sugar or something else. But we'll circle back to that as we get to the end. Maybe a bit of a hook to have people listen through the end. But as you said, I'm not worried about energy and excitement that the guest will bring. Pete Fontana, welcome to the podcast. We find that we have a lot better success inviting interesting people than trying to pretend to be interesting ourselves. We're excited to have you with us today, man.
Thank you very much, Jeff and Mark. I appreciate it. I'm glad to be here today.
Yeah, we're excited to have you and look forward to the conversation. A lot of these are just a lot of things going on out there in the appraisal and in real estate space generally. You've had a very focused kind of approach on certain things. But before we dive too much into the topic, would love to give you a few minutes to just introduce yourself broadly, and then love for you to kind of round that out with what you're doing as far as heading up a task force that's been commissioned by the Appraisal Foundation.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. I'll just give an introduction. My name is Pete Fontana. I'm an appraiser in Montana. And I started my career about 30 years ago as the county assessor in one of the largest counties in Montana. And I had no experience with appraisal or assessment at the time. I had graduated from the University of Montana with a degree in finance and accounting, and found the accounting world to be awfully boring for me. And so I spent 1 year in the accounting field, and then I was elected a county assessor, and actually had no idea what that particular job entailed. And so that, talk about trial by fire and learning on the job, that was a clear for me that I had a lot to learn. I spent 13 years doing that, and at the end of that career, I ended up being the residential model builder for the state of Montana. So the state of Montana is a little bit unique, where the Department of Revenue completes the entire appraisal assessment tax scheme for every county, even though they have individual assessors in each county. The state of Montana builds all the models and provides all the valuation. So I was the statewide model builder for all the valuation products under the residential umbrella. In the same time, halfway through my career as an elected official, I obtained my license using mass appraisal experience. And this was prior to the 2008 criteria change, and then also prior to the 2015 criteria change. And I became a licensed appraiser and started doing appraisal work on the side as well. And it was pretty clear to me that I was going to be more successful in a private practice than I was working for the government. And so I eventually quit my job as the county assessor, and I opened up a private practice. I've spent 17 years as a state regulator in Montana. I'm currently the chair of the Montana board, and I serve on the Associated Regulatory Officials Board. I also serve on the Board of Trustees, which I'm looking forward to serving with Jeff. Jeff's one of our new trustees starting January 1st. And so I serve on the Board of Trustees, and I've been a trustee for 7 years with the Appraisal Foundation as well. So I've spent most of my career in government service and in private practice, but mostly focused on regulation. I'm not a designated member of any organization. I'm unaffiliated, which is how I got positioned on the Board of Trustees to begin with. I'm an unaffiliated member because I focused my career on regulation. And so And that's where it's taken me today. We still have a thriving private practice of a small residential appraisal firm in central Montana, which is why this project that we're going to talk about today, the State Harmonization Task Force, is so near and dear to my heart. Montana is 56 counties in the fourth largest state. I drive 800 miles a week, just me, not including my other 4 appraisers. And that only covers 5 counties in central Montana. And so Montana is extremely sparsely populated, and so that's not unusual. The Dakotas, Texas, southern Colorado, Wyoming. And so there's these states that have a real issue with population and a number of appraisers available to do the work that is required to collateralize loans. So the beginning of this year, our chairman of the Appraisal Foundation wanted to stand up a task force to try to make states more consistent in their approach to licensure. And so under our Vision 2030 project, one of our goals is just that, is to help states become more consistent in their approach to licensure. We're not talking about regulation, because the foundation already produced a disciplinary matrix years ago that is voluntary, and states can use that in hopes that they would be more consistent in their disciplinary process. This is about licensure and getting people into the industry and not the regulation portion of it. And so they stood this task force up and asked me to chair it, and I was thrilled to do it. But one of the things that I wanted to make sure we do was bring partners in to help on the task force that had the requisite experience to actually make meaningful change in these states. And so at the foundation, we have 20 partners that partner with us, and that's everybody from Farm Credit to the Appraisal Institute to the International Association of Assessing Officers to right-of-way appraisers. So we have a whole gamut of partners. So it was essential for me to select team members that were partners. And so we partner with the Appraisal Institute, IAAO, because they're the ones that have the most appraisers of anybody in America, and they're in every single county because they're the tax assessing appraisers. So in Montana, we have 56 counties. 30 counties don't have a fee appraiser in them, but all of them have a tax assessor appraiser that has requisite experience. And there's some states that just don't allow that experience to be used for licensure. So that's what the goal was, is to set this task force up with people that had the experience with state law, rules, and regulations, which the Appraisal Institute does in their government affairs and their government affairs director. IAAO, they work with every single state government to provide credible valuations for assessment and tax purposes. And people like John Russell, that was a former trustee that has dedicated his career as a non-practicing lawyer, but to the real estate appraisal field. It was important that I have him on the team. And so we assembled a team of experts that would help us move this initiative forward. And so our goal was to do direct engagement. And so we are going to the states, to their board meetings in person, and doing direct engagement with these states on these overlays they have. And so that's a little bit of background of where we got to, who I am and how we got this task force started. And if you have questions for me, I'm happy to answer them, or I can just continue to tell you what we're doing, but I'll pause there.
Yeah, no problem. Well, 2 things strike me, Pete. First, I promise to be on my best behavior. I want to minimize the hazing process, whatever that might be, joining the board of trustees with you being a seasoned veteran. So I'm hoping not to incur any wrath from you on the front end. But secondarily, it strikes me that you've got a lot of experience and kind of a career and background in regulation. And if I'm hearing you right, a lot of the focus of this harmonization is, kind of deregulatory in a sense that it's pulling back overlays that the states, have imposed on licensing, that exceed what the AQB has put out as the minimum requirements. And so I'm curious, what do you see as the benefits, or what are some of the purposes behind that effort, to roll back some of these more restrictive requirements that states have, maybe to get us started there?
Yeah, sure. That's a great place to lead into. So I think it's important to note that our task force isn't trying to minimize any criteria. That, number one, we don't have the authority to do that. And number two, that's not really our job. So the AQB sets out the minimum criteria, and anybody can read that in the criteria handbook. And then the states under FIREA would have the ability to increase or go over the minimum criteria. So they could have what we call overlays. And some overlays are fine. So the AQB doesn't require you to have a high school diploma. So you just have to be 18 years old. Well, some states require that to have a professional license You have to be 18 years old and have a high school diploma. We're not going to attack that overlay. That is an overlay, but it's not an overlay that's really keeping anybody necessarily out of this business. So we have to look at how the overlay affects people getting in the business. So we're not trying to open the floodgates, because that's not our job. Plus, I don't have the authority to do that. That's the AQB's job. We're just trying to make states aware of why do they have the overlay, and doesn't even make sense. Remember, these boards turn over every time a gubernatorial administration turns over. The boards turn over, and so and then people retire in state government. They get a new executive officer, a new administrator, and so sometimes they just don't even. They're not really introspective and reflective of why they have these rules over and above the criteria. And so we're trying to just sit down with them, have a direct conversation about them being reflective of why they did it. And so what I always ask them is, like, if you were writing a rule today to have an overlay, I would encourage you to have a statement of reasonable necessity. Why are you doing this? Is it going to make your first-time test taker scores better than the national average? Is it going to reduce the number of complaints because you've better educated this individual, or they have more experience? And so if you can't write a statement of reasonable necessity of why you would have an overlay, then maybe there's no reason to do that. And so we're just trying to have them be more reflective. And it's surprising that we've been to 7 states so far, and every one of them is 100% on board with doing whatever it needs to be done to change, not just to comply with what I'm asking them to do, but to be reflective and say, we're going to have a crisis coming if 20% of the appraisers drop out after UAD 3.6 comes online this next year. Who knows what the AQB criteria is going to be in 2026? And so we're just asking them to be reflective, be prepared, and try not to have these inappropriate or overburdensome overlays. And so one of the overlays that we found was extremely odd was that you couldn't get experience if the property was more than 50 miles away from your home office. And I asked the chief legal counsel of that board, why and when did that come about? And she was like, well, that's been on the books since 1990. My goodness, that's a quarter of a century past Y2K. I mean, think about how long ago that was. But also be reflective of what happened, 35 years ago. MLSs were published in a book and they were 3 months behind. So you went and got the book at your MLS and you had these little black and white photos. But so so I understand the 50 miles thing to make yourself, in the old term, geographically competent. Now, USPAP just says you have to be competent in all areas, just geographically, the assignment type. And so I guess I do understand that. But today, with all the data that's available at your fingertips, your MLS has got you're required to put the closed data in within 24 hours. With, like it or not, Zillow has tons of published information. You can become competent and drive more than 50 miles away. So in Montana, if that was the case, if you didn't look at your own house, you probably wouldn't be looking at anybody's houses because your neighbor might be 50 miles away. So that was a requirement that they had, that it was just hung out there on their administrative rules. And they also had a requirement that you couldn't get any credit if you didn't do an interior inspection. Remember, USPAP doesn't require any inspection. And so there was no reason for that one either. And so that state we met with, big win for us. They reduced all those barriers to entry and kind of adopted the AQB criteria. So that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to say that we're going to reduce the requirements so everybody can get in the business. That's the AQB's job. That's not my job. My job is just to make sure that the congressionally authorized authority, which is the AQB, to set the minimum criteria, that's very well thought out. If you're going to increase and go above that, have a statement of reasonable necessity so the public can say, well, here's why the state of Montana did that. But we can't find any of that data in the states. And of course, 35 years later, they've went through 200 board members. Yeah. So that's our job. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to accomplish. And we're not trying to diminish the industry to let anybody in without meeting all the criteria of the AQB. We're just trying to have the states be a little bit more reflective of why they have the overlays.
Pete, it is so encouraging to learn of this harmonization effort here, and because law and regulation is kind of similar. I'm reminded of the Ronald Reagan quote as I'm listening to you talk, that nothing is more permanent than a temporary government program, something like that. You know, you you put something in place, and I think the natural course of government is that you don't really review it or look at it. And you know, it sounds like you guys are taking a moment to talk to folks and saying, hey, should this be here, and should this exist? And I imagine the catalyst, I guess first, before I get to that, I see this sort of thing. We're in a moment of deregulation ideology, which I think is exciting on some level. And you know, whether it's I happen to follow the like autonomous driving industry, like it's kind of interesting to me. And so NHTSA is the group, the national group that regulates this. Well, they're trying to fight. Let's please not have individual jurisdiction rules and regulations to try and follow. And you know, and I see this artificial intelligence discussion in this. I think the big beautiful bill had this incorporated, where they were trying to have a national standard and not let state. I think it was 10-year pause on states creating rules and regulations around all this stuff. And I'm not sure that it stuck, but this regulatory modernization is really it seems so critical because it inhibits growth and flexibility for an industry to react one way or another. So it's really encouraging.
Yeah, and that's the challenge here. Is like you almost want to say, why did they allow the states to have this ability to, when you congressionally authorized an organization to set the standards and criteria to become an appraiser? I don't really understand why 35 years ago they allowed states to have overlays over those. I mean, it didn't make much sense to me, because if this is the criteria to become an appraiser, and the result of the reason the appraisal industry stood up and the licensing and regulation was stood up under FIREA is because of there was no licensing requirements. So if you're going to put licensing requirements into play, I'm not sure why you allowed states to have these overlays. Be that as it may, they have the ability to do that. I'm not knocking them. I'm no expert on FIREA and how that was written and why that was written. But we also have to be aware that the AQB is a little bit complicit in some of these issues as well, because the states take that AQB criteria and they use that as their Bible for licensure. And so the definition, so for example, the definition of supervisor in the criteria is not clear enough. And so if you read the criteria, this definition of supervisor says you're certified residential or general, and then it gives some criteria. And then the last sentence, it says if necessary. Well, the states can't take a leap to say, what does if necessary mean? Well, the intention is, because the states, the AQB criteria allows mass appraisal experience and review appraisal experience. Well, you might be working for an assessor that has all the IAAO credentials, and they're not licensed or certified. And so they think, well, that experience doesn't count because the supervisor that's signing the log isn't licensed or isn't certified residential or general. The AQB needs to do a better job in explaining that when it says if necessary, you don't necessarily have to be that if you're in a job like a right-of-way appraiser and your right-of-way supervisor is not licensed or certified, but they're certified under the International Right-of-Way Association. But they're not a general certified appraiser. They're doing yellow book appraisals. Also, the criteria says that experience has to be USPAP compliant. Well, tribal land appraisals are not USPAP compliant, but they're compliant with the assignment requirements for the Department of Interior and on Indian land. Right-of-way appraisals are not USPAP compliant because they're yellow book appraisals. Even though they say that yellow book and USPAP are concurrent, states are saying, well, that's not USPAP compliant. That's ridiculous. That experience doesn't count toward licensure. And so the criteria is going to have to, hopefully in the 2026 criteria, and Jeff, this is one thing that you'll learn right away on the Board of Trustees, is that we don't get to direct what the Standards Board and the Qualification Board does. And so I can't go to them directly and say, hey guys, like, you're part of the problem. I'm not saying they are, but they have to have a better definition of supervisor. So in the state of Washington, for example, their statutory language, so theirs is in statute. They are good with changing everything to meet the criteria at the minimum criteria, but they have a statute that defines supervisor as certified residential or commercial, basically what the criteria says. So if you're working for an assessment office in King County in Seattle and your supervisor is a certified general appraiser, all your experience in the assessment office counts in Washington. You're in the neighboring county, and your supervisor, the county assessor there, has all the credentials from the IAAO. They're a certified assessment examiner, so they've basically got the equivalent of MAI in their field. None of that individual's experience counts working under that person because he's not licensed or certified. So that's just because that's the way their statute's written. So we just have to help them recraft their statute, but also the AQB criteria has to change a little bit on definitions. Again, not directing them what to do, but that's why we have partners at the foundation. We rely on people like the International Association of Assessing Officers, the right-of-way people, the Appraisal Institute, to write letters in response to the concept paper and that tell them we need help with this. So, so the states aren't totally at fault. They're trying to follow the criteria because the criteria might be a little bit ambiguous, and so we've got to work on both ends of this.
You know, it's such a good point, Pete. And I think, you know, as you're talking about some of these issues that come up, I certainly they were unintended initially, but you get a lot of, there's just a lot of different spaces within the appraisal and valuation profession generally. And most people are familiar with residential real estate and mortgage lending. And so most people are familiar with the residential appraisal piece, but you're talking about a lot of other aspects that aren't that, but are certainly valuation at their core. You know, I did want to just give maybe a shout out or a heads up. We are going to have the good fortune of having you address a group, Pete, at the Appraisal Summit that's coming up at the end of September, September 28th. NAA is putting on a supervisor trainee event that Sunday afternoon where Pete will be talking about state harmonization, but we're also going to have people from IAAO coming and talking about a career in assessing and assessment, as well as some other providers talking about different pathways to gaining this this experience as well. There's the traditional supervisor route, there's practicum, there's PAREA. Mark and I have done kind of a deep dive on the PAREA side, and we've had at least one practicum guest on in the past talking about just how you different avenues to gaining experience. So as we're on that topic, I wanted to just, kind of point out that we're going to have some additional information, probably a deeper dive at, maybe a little more granular level at some of the state harmonization task force wins at some of the various state levels. One thing, Pete, I wanted to do in the context of this conversation is, given that this touches such a broad base of people or practitioners within the valuation space, as we were talking a little bit offline, we discussed the fact and the reality that there are some transitions taking place in the real estate space on the residential side. And you've alluded to this UAD 3.6 that's going to have an impact. Everyone, I think, expects, it's hard to know how much, but will have an impact on the appraiser population. You've talked about some of the partners, including the National Association of Realtors or NAR, offering help and support. What's your, maybe as we zoom out, broader based perspective on, why harmonization and rolling back unnecessary regulations matters in the context of maintaining deal flow for everybody that's involved in the residential, kind of real estate transaction process?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff, and that's why this harmonization task force at the core is trying to get states to reduce their barriers to entry. But the big broader picture of this is that when you couple this with the new rollout of the UAD 3.6, and the industry insiders are predicting, a 15 to 20% retirement ratio because people are just not going to want to engage in the digital world and collect data on a tablet and do it all digitally. And so we will just have to wait and see on that. But if you look at the trends from the ASC website over the last 10 years, we've lost 25 to 30,000 appraisers already with no major changes in the way we do the work, other than the introduction of hybrids, the introduction of bifurcated appraisals, and these other appraisal products. But they're really not, you can say you don't want to do them, but it really didn't change your method of doing the appraisal from an analytical standpoint, other than you're using somebody else's data. This UAD 3.6 is dimensionally changes how the appraisal is going to be captured and reported to your client. And so that being said, if we have a 15% to 20% attrition ratio next year, over the next 2 years, it's going to be very difficult for us to manage a crisis in the middle of a crisis, where we're going to try to recruit people to become appraisers. And then think about that. Anybody that's trained in appraisal, you're looking at 2 years from start to finish, unless you find somebody that's got requisite experience. And that's why we're trying to tap into the assessment personnel. These people today have the requisite experience to become appraisers. They've been doing modeling and data analytics for 50 years. And they were always knocked for that because it's like, okay, you just built this model, and it's the old Zillow thing. Oh yeah, here's my Zillow sheet. This is what I need you to appraise my house at. But the fact is that these people now have the experience of what the industry needs today, which are data analysts that understand AVM metrics, that understand what modeling is, and understands what data analysis is. And so if we get in a situation where we have to recruit appraisers, wouldn't it be nice to go recruit appraisers out of appraisal assessment offices that already have 5 and 10 years experience, where you can get them trained up and get them that licensed residential certificate in 12 months? I'm a big fan of Perea. I'm a big fan of the practicums, but it's just not moving the needle at scale. So we got to try to reduce the barriers to entry. And so to answer your question, this is a broader, this affects realtors, this affects title companies, because if there's no availability of appraisers and it draws out the closing time for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, because we had to wait for an appraiser, or if the interest rates drop and there's a big rush for refinancing and there's not enough appraisers, I keep telling the folks in the industry, appraisers especially, they're going to get these values to collateralize their instruments one way or another, with or without you. And if we don't try to make it, I'm not saying make it easier to get in, but just meet the minimum criteria, the AQB, to get in the industry and kind of get out of the way with these overlays, we're going to be burying, we're killing our own profession, because people that need valuation are going to get it one way or another. Don't forget, they don't have to have valuations on anything under 400,000. A lot of them do it just to collateralize their risk with somebody telling them that it's okay. But what if they just say, okay, anything under 400,000, we're just not going to do anything? That meets the federal requirements, and that's a bad thing for appraisers. So we want them to understand is we're not trying. And so everybody, that's why the realtors are so supportive of appraisers. They know they want somebody else verifying what that value is worth, especially the ones that are representing the buyers. And so almost all of our partners, the 20 partners of the foundation, are 100% behind this. And that's, most of those partners aren't appraiser partners.
Mm-hmm.
And so even in the rural areas, Farm Credit is a big supporter of this. Farm Credit's even standing up their own practicum. They granted $10,000 to the foundation as a contributor to help stand up a rural ag practicum, because they can't get anybody to be ag appraisers, because they got to start somewhere. You just don't start from zero and say, okay, I'm going to get a general certified appraiser and become an ag appraiser. Some might, but most of it's a progression. So it affects everybody in this industry, from lenders to realtors to title companies, because if the appraisal is going to be a delay, they're going to get these values one way or another. And my preference is they use us. But if there's not enough people, what are you going to do?
They'll do something different. I definitely agree with you, Pete. And I think that's been one of the themes that we've touched on repeatedly on this podcast is markets are dynamic. What they demand from participants changes and evolves over time. And, like you said, 40 years ago, when your only source of data was the printed MLS book that was 3 months old and was, a small little thing, the appraiser really was the gatekeeper of the data. Well, today, that's not the reality. Like you said, you can find way more information online, anybody, than what you could in the past. And so as a result, what is being required or demanded of valuation practitioners is different, which is okay. I mean, I may not want to change what I've always done historically, but what I want and what the market demands of me as a valuation practitioner varies a lot. And I think you make a really good point, Pete, that our realtor partners and most residential appraisers that subscribe to an MLS system are a realtor member. By default, you have to be to join the association to get the information in the first place. But as I go and talk with realtors, go to sales offices and answer questions, or they call in and hey, I've got a question about this. How much is a pool worth today? Or I've got this weird property I don't know how to value very well. What are your thoughts? They really do, at least especially the good ones, really do value the perspective of appraisers whose whole focus is on this very specific valuation component of real estate. there's a whole lot of stuff that goes into facilitating a transaction that isn't valuation related, but they have, as you look at their education and licensing requirements compared to the appraisers, the amount of time they spend on valuing properties in the education process is, it's a few hours in their education course, whereas appraisers are, hundreds of hours and, 1,000+ hours of experience into that very specific topic. And so as appraisers find ways to leverage their unique skill set and specialization, it's a value to the real estate community as a whole. And we don't want to be walking away from the services we can provide, like you say, because we're unwilling to adapt to an evolving market. So it just, the points you make, I think, really resonated, and I just wanted to highlight that.
And remember, Jeff, what happened in North Dakota several years ago, they asked for a waiver so that they could accept appraisal assignments from non-appraisers.
Yep.
I was not a supporter of that, because I asked, one of the requirements is that they didn't have to be a licensed or certified appraiser, but their appraisal had to meet USPAP compliance. And I said, okay, I'm okay with that, but who's going to review the appraisals that are coming in? They're not appraisers, to see if they meet USPAP compliance, to see if they're going to extend that waiver, because it was one for 1 year. Well, it kind of fell flat on its face and it didn't get renewed after a year. But when you've got states asking for waivers, these rural states that don't have appraisers, and you start diminishing the number of appraisers, that's not good for our industry. And so, again, I'm a state regulator, a veteran state regulator, and I'm not letting anybody off the hook if a client files a complaint and it's problematic. But what I don't do is tortiously interfere with somebody wanting to get into the industry that meets the minimum requirements that the AQB set out. And I tell them, when you get your license, congratulations, you don't know anything. Be careful, and I hope I never see you again. Because if I do, it'll be a complaint. So proceed with caution, and welcome to the industry. They're not experts. They have 1 year experience if they're a licensed appraiser. And just tell them you need to be competent, be careful. That's up to you to decide. We're not trying to open the floodgates to people that are unqualified. And so there's only 9 states that adopt the criteria in whole. So when the criteria changes, that's it. That's what it is. And so 41 states have overlays, and 9 of the states have an overlay that doesn't allow a licensed category. And that's a real barrier, because that should be the entry into the profession. There's safeguards around that. You can't do anything over $1 million. It can't be complex. Again, you are to determine the complexity as the appraiser, but that should be the entry level where that person's really developing what they learned in their, whether it's Perea Practicum or the old mentor trainee. That's where they should start learning the process. But 7 states don't even allow that license level. And so that's a barrier to entry, because that's the easiest way to get it. Now, good for the AI, their new Perea program, they allow certified residential. You can go right into that. And one of the things I'll point out about the traditional supervisor model that I think is why I believe it's a little bit broken. So I think you've all have seen the pass-fail ratio on the first-time test taker score. So like in the CG, I think it's 54%. Certified residential, it's 62%. And the licensed residential, it's 65, 66, somewhere in there. Perea has graduated 40 people. All 40 people passed the exam on their first try. Mm-hmm. Melissa Bond's practicum down in Mississippi, she has a 92% pass-fail ratio on her candidates. And I think she's had 30, 40 candidates herself. And in Colorado, we had their administrator on with us at Arrow last year. They've licensed 15 or 16 assessor candidates, and all of them passed the test on their first time. So what that illustrates is maybe the old model where that you think you have to get drugged around with the supervisor is not the best, because they're not training these people to pass the test. And that could be 3 things. 1, the test might be too difficult. 2, everybody front loads their education, and then they try to find a mentor, and it takes them 6-8 months, if ever, to find one. And then they find one. Well, they took all their classes because they could do that. Well, imagine graduating your last semester in college and you have 4 classes, and then you don't get to take the final exam for a year. So a lot of it could be the distance between the education and the exam, and a lot of it could be the supervisor. Where I see a lot of applications come in, and we look at the reports and we're like, oh my gosh, well, it's the work product of the supervisor. Yep. And the last thing we want to do is start disciplining supervisors. That's not what we want to do, because who wants to be one then if that's going to happen? But you have to realize that these other programs are training these people more well-rounded because they're looking at everything in the appraisal process and then taking their education and taking the exam. I'm not advocating doing away with the supervisor. I'm just saying that that's why there's this national attention on, is there a better path to the entry level? Not that it requires no experience, but I have 20 years experience as a broker. If I take all the education and I take the exam and pass it, and I write a capstone appraisal that passes a standard 3 review, what difference does it make where my experience came from?
You bet.
Yeah.
You bet. Yep.
So those are the big topics we want to talk about at the state harmonization thing. Is like the gatekeeper is the exam, and then you're doing work product review because you're required to do it by the ASC. And so if their work product review comes back and they have all assessment experience and they did a standard 1 and 2 appraisal for you and it came back clean, what difference does it make what that experience log says? Just as long as it adds up to 1,000 hours. So you see what our pitch is like, and that doesn't necessarily matter where the experience came from. Can you demonstrate you can apply it to a standard 1 and 2 report? Because that's the license you're asking for. So that's our message.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to do.
Pete, it's fascinating to take a kind of a deep dive into this and think through it. And, this podcast, we've been very supportive of Perea in large part because we have been supervisors ourselves for 2 decades. And, I've said multiple times on this podcast that like during certain times, 10 plus years ago, I didn't want to talk to someone looking for a supervisor unless they'd been looking for 12 months because they didn't know what I was offering, like this is pretty unique and you don't come in entitled and it's not easy. And you talk about overlays and boy, if to get experience, that is the barrier, right? And then the definition of experience is one of the things that you are covering in depth. There's different definitions all over the place. And then in whole, we're ignoring relevant experience. But, on the residential side, Pete, I'm sure you deal with this some, but there are also lender overlays to an assignment that don't allow a trainee to participate.
Right.
And, and in most cases, they participate at whatever direction the supervisor feels comfortable on the commercial side. But we are fighting this fight constantly in the residential space that a trainee, the name itself kind of communicates lack of ability or know-how but there is presumed risk in allowing a trainee to participate. So people just don't. Well, where does the supervisor find incentive or area to get experience to people that are coming through? It presents real problems. And I'm, please.
I mean, it does present real problems. And, like I've had 7 or 8 trainees, and I used to look, I knew how experienced my people were at the assessment office. Guess where I went and rated my people from? All but one of my trainees, of all my trainees, had non-assessment experience. They already had all the education through IAAO, the principles, procedures. They had all the experience how to measure houses. I mean, I cut my training time down to about 30%. And then specifically drilled down on individual finite fee appraisal techniques. But they already had the requisite experience. And so how do you define that experience? I use this example all the time. What a standard 9 and 10 is business valuation. That's a big part of the foundation's board. We have business values on a board. We have a business valuation committee. And you have an individual working for a big 8 accounting firm that's doing business valuation on businesses. And they think, well, I just want to get my certified general appraiser license because a lot of our evaluations include real estate too, and that'll look good on my resume and my credentials. So none of that experience. You've been a 20-year business valuer. It counts toward experience for you. But remember, you have to take all that education. You're not exempting them from that. And then they can't sit for the exam because 20 years of business valuation experience and you're a certified public accountant isn't good enough because it's not defined that way, because it's not USPAP compliant. And that to me has got to change. Experience has to be. So when we interviewed the State Regulatory Advisory Group, SRAG, which is one of our advisory groups at the foundation, they weren't necessarily concerned about what the log was. In fact, all they did was pick 3 appraisals off of it because they were required by the ASC to randomly select some appraisals and then have one reviewed to make sure that it was good to go. So you took 3 out of a log of 500, and then you assumed that the rest of the 497 were just as good, right? You looked at one report. It might have been the best one, or it might have been the worst one. So they might have, your whole body of work is either good or bad on one report. I don't really care for that either, but that's, I digress. So the SRAG group was like, well, we don't really care what the log says. They really like the capstone thing, where it's the demonstration that they can apply what they learned wherever they got their experience at, and demonstrate that they can write that in a USPAP compliant report. That really demonstrates they know what they're doing. And so even the State Regulatory Advisory Group, which is made up of all the state regulators, agrees that experience doesn't necessarily have to be USPAP compliant, as long as they can demonstrate they can apply USPAP in that standard 1 and 2 report when they review it. So that's some things we're asking the AQB to look at as well, and just to be open-minded about that, because you don't want to leave people out of an industry that are willing to get into it because they don't have this finite kind of experience that was, and so we want to be more open-minded about it.
I think that's the right approach, Pete. And the way I've come to kind of think about it or frame it in my own mind is, how can we preserve and even strengthen the standards by which we measure people that are qualified to come in, while at the same time reducing the unnecessary barriers that don't really have anything to do with qualifying somebody well. I mean, I've got somebody today that would take the exam and get licensed if their state allowed it. It is ready to go, but is still kind of slogging along because they don't have the license level. Certification is the only option in their state, and so, as we wrap up, I just wanted to express appreciation for you coming and kind of presenting or highlighting, what the purpose is and what it isn't. And I don't think anybody, is wanting to reduce the standards by which an appraiser is measured to become an appraiser. But when we have things that really aren't, helping lift the standard or maintain a high standard, it's a requirement, but it may be a requirement that doesn't do any good. Pulling those sorts of things back makes all the sense in the world to me as well. So, we would definitely wish you Godspeed on this effort. Rolling back unnecessary requirement, I think, is a noble work and endeavor. We'll stay in touch, Pete, and would love to have an update down the road as how successes that you all are having with the harmonization task force.
Yeah, we'd love to come back as we continue to meet with states, and we started getting states actually converting to more reasonable non-overlays. We'd love to come back, but looking forward to seeing you at the conference in Vegas. I know that you'll like to hear from my colleague on our sister task force at the IAAO, because they have we've joined forces with them, and so we've got a lot of good information for you at that conference.
Yeah, definitely. I'm looking forward to that as well. Would invite anybody who's available to come. The purpose in that is to present as much good and helpful information to those in the profession or looking to come into the profession as possible. And so the Appraisal Summit, we can maybe post a link in the show here to how to access that. But definitely look forward to connecting with you then, Pete, and on foundation meetings, and also celebrating some successes as the task force has as we move forward.
Indeed.
So again, thank you for being with us today.
Jeff, Mark, thank you. I appreciate it. Nice meeting you, Mark.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for coming. See you soon.
Yep, you bet.
Well, Mark, we were having so much fun that we just didn't want to stop the conversation yet, which you and I, if nothing else, can at least talk a little bit. But good conversation, fun to get a sense from Pete as to what's happening at that level. As you zoom out, it really seems to be an extension of this deregulation emphasis. And you touched on it, in the conversation with him at a national level. You don't want to compromise standards that really matter. But what happens, and I think your quote from Ronald Reagan made a lot of sense, a temporary government project, temporary government program, temporary government, regulation, they just balloon and cascade, and build upon themselves. And so, looking at what really makes sense, pulling things back, to me, definitely is not a wasted or kind of inconsequential effort. And so, fun conversation there. Figured, maybe we ought to touch base while we still have some life force left in us. We haven't totally deteriorated yet, but how's the fast going for you? And what's your plan to resume eating again?
Yeah, Jeff. So on last podcast, we talked about fasting a little bit here and there, and a few listeners have commented on that being an area of interest. And you and I have quietly done that on our own and independently, never really at the same time. Notable that we said we were going to do this on the last podcast, and you and I didn't really talk about it at all. Not Sunday night when we started, not Monday morning, not even Tuesday morning. It wasn't until yesterday, Tuesday afternoon, that we connected. Said, "Hey, are you doing it like we said we were going to?" And I think you were out on a walk trying to recuperate from a light head or something. I was calling you, I think, a little bit for some support because your last minute invite to an Astros game on Dollar Hot Dog Night. And we were also my group was given some free popcorn, and that was required quite a bit of restraint, but I held strong. Yeah. So the third day of fasting, so started Sunday night, today is Wednesday, and, I plan to kind of reintroduce with some bone broth this afternoon around 5 or 6 p.m. to kind of get through the full 3 days. So yeah, that's a little bit of an update for me. How has this time been for you?
It's funny. You almost don't set one of these things and not have something in the 3 days that comes up where you're like, oh crap, man, I really wish that I wasn't doing this right now. It wasn't last night. 2 nights ago, my wife wanted me to make shakes, for the family, and my daughter. So they went to the store and got some stuff, and I made them and watched them eat them, and it was fine. I think I flew under the radar. I don't know that they even realized that I didn't have any. But it's interesting, Mark. One of the things that stands out to me is, and I thought about this while, being a bit hungry lately, but, we talked a little bit about, kind of a reset, in just your processes or like your dietary habits or whatever. A number of years ago, my wife and I went to Six Flags, Mountain Magic theme park, and we had a very specific strategy. We said, we're going to ride the biggest, scariest ride first thing in the morning, like the first ride that we do. And then at that point, we'll know everything else isn't quite as bad or as scary. And I find that, if you're having a hard time kind of getting back on track with eating or budgeting or whatever, doing a real heavy push, kind of an intense push makes the follow-up, not seem nearly as bad. And that seems to be the effect here. So it's a good experience. It's tough in different ways. It seems like just not doing something shouldn't be hard, but like when you're just programmed to want to eat, you snack while you're driving, you snack while you're doing whatever, sit in front of the computer for hours at a time. It's a bit of a break with the process, and you realize how much you think about, maybe only semi-consciously, what you're going to eat next or what you're going to munch on in the moment or whatever. And so it's, it kind of forces you to reevaluate your process throughout the day, even because it's, just remove the whole aspect of food, 4 days at a time. It's good. It's worth doing. I think I'll be same time frame as you. Got a couple of yogurts I think I'll be starting with to kind of jumpstart the system again, and hopefully not overdo it.
It's a bit of a clumsy connection, but our discussion with Pete Fontana in going to these different state boards and just sort of politely shaking them and just saying, hey, have you thought about what you've been doing the last 30 years, with your regulation or whatever? Probably not a lot of thought when this overlay was laid in. Of the many benefits, one of the principal ones I find is that this dietary reset or fast is a bit of shaking of a momentum that builds for me over the course of 3 or 4 months. But boy, left untouched for 10 years, it gets really, you fill every dull moment with consumption. And on whether I'm driving, whether I'm having a conversation, my wife and I have coffee on the back patio every morning, and without the coffee, it's you just think, well, man, I'm just sitting here having water, or it's just all of the reset and a reminder of how much I habitually am stuffing my face. It's a really good reset, and it does stick with me for a while. Not forever. I wish it did, but it does stick with me for a while. That shaking and awareness of and really a fight against overconsumption, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's just one of those things you don't think about. I think the connection to the regulation really isn't, that clumsy, because these things just pile up and mount over time. And, until you have a reason or force yourself to stop and evaluate, it can be a bit of a wake-up call. The other thing I thought about through this process, and this is also a little bit clumsy and silly, but growing up, I really liked the Rocky movies, and it was interesting in the third one where he finally wins the title, right? And then has a series of fights that he wins, but his trainer tells him, you haven't been hungry since you won the title, meaning like he hasn't been willing to do whatever it takes to win. It's been, okay, opponents, but not somebody that was a real threat of like, kind of dethroning him or whatever. And there's just an aspect of like hunger or like, and not even just for food specifically, but whether it's hungering after, a success or a personal goal, a business goal, a financial goal, whatever, that you're like, I'm just going to do whatever it takes to reach this end. There's something about that analogy. And I think the reason that the trainer uses the term being hungry, it wasn't that he had to fast to be a good, boxer. In fact, probably the contrary, but it was that, that hunger in a like deeper sense of, I'll do whatever, I'll yearn and long for something that in a way that will force me to take the action that I have to. And in fasting, the action is non-consumption, like you said, but it's a bit of a reset of mentality, and I think can kind of sharpen or hone your willingness to say, man, this is uncomfortable, but I'm exercising that muscle of being uncomfortable in pursuit of something that I value greater, and it's easy to just get comfortable and kind of coast without self-imposed or external impositions on getting you out of your comfort zone.
Jeff, that the Rocky and Hungry kind of theme there, I don't know if I certainly talked about this within our company during the Major League Baseball All-Star break, but I think it was Francisco Lindor. Somebody was interviewed in the locker room, and it was like, man, you work hard. Where do you find your motivation? And his response was, motivation. I'm not trying to be motivated. Motivation comes and goes. I'm trying to be disciplined, and disciplined is where the hard work comes in every day and all that. And I think this is an exercise in discipline on some level, and feeds a lot of different areas. It is very hard to get through the first 24 hours. My friends that I was with the game last night, man, I don't think I could do that even for 24 hours. And most people feel that way, and I do too. In fact, the first times I did it, it was pretty scary. It's like, yeah, I did like minorly, but scary. Like, oh, I can't eat for the next 24 hours. I'm hungry now. So the last thing I'll say, Jeff, is that I find motivation to get through like 2 days or 36 hours or whatever I think are good ways to do it. But every hour additional that I hang on, I feel like is recuperative for the body in this sort of like cleansing and what they call autophagy, which is like starving all your cells, but the weak cells die first. I think there's limited proof that that's the case, but at least hypothesis. And so, as I hold into 2, 4, 5, 6 o'clock today, or not stop it last night, 2 days in, I'm really focused on, man, I've done this work all the way here. Let's, every extra hour I can hang on will get additional benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do build up, I don't know if a tolerance, but at least kind of I'm going to be okay doing this. Now, there's always a temptation to take things to the extreme, and we joked about passing out. I'm not looking to sign up for going a lot longer than than the 3 days, but it's been kind of a fun, interesting shared experience. We've talked off and on in the past as to when somebody was doing something. It's, hey, I'm experiencing this. Have you experienced that or not? Like going through this process, and so it's been a lot of fun. We'll maybe we'll make it a tradition. Maybe we won't. We're at least not hangry and like yelling at each other at this point. So I guess that that's some level of success.
Even though we didn't talk about it leading up to and during for the majority of it, it was the first time I've had an accountability partner in that way, and that was certainly helpful to get through the dollar hot dog night.
Well, I've had that thought more than once too. Like, well, even if I want to eat something, I can't because I'm going to have to be talking to Mark about it on the podcast. So, no, it's been good. I think just one last thing we wanted to touch on, and then before we wrap things up and completely bore our listeners, GDP out today. The economy's not fasting, apparently. What are you seeing on the read on that, Mark?
Boy, yes. Second quarter, 3% growth, the most growth we've seen in a quarter since I think October of 2024. I think 2% was the expectation, so it was a really, really big beat. President Trump didn't hesitate to put pressure based on that news to Powell, who I think maybe meeting or speaking today. I'm not entirely sure, but Tony Reese, friend of the podcast, co-worker of you and I's, was quick to point out that every bit of news, good or bad, or perceived good or bad, raises the 10-year Treasury. That's happened with this good news. So I'm not sure we're getting lower rates one way or another, Jeff, but I do think what we see is a picture with this European Union tariff deal done. That is a big overhang. And in fact, it was a big surprise because I think European Union seemed to be fighting back and furthest away from a deal being met. So, this is another really big domino to fall. And as every one of these reduces the uncertainty, and in the deal terms that are getting structured sure seem to be good for the country and from an economic perspective.
It really does. And I keep hoping that some of this good news will actually become good news again, instead of good news is bad news from an interest rate perspective. I did see or hear some reporting this morning. So the Fed has their meeting today, and I think they're voting, holy crap, maybe right now, on interest rate cuts. The expectation is hold steady. But the part in the reporting that was interesting is that there's an expectation that up to 2 of the Fed governors may vote for a cut, which would, if I remember this right, was in a Wall Street Journal article. I think they said the first time in 30 years that they anticipate there could be 2 dissenting votes in the Fed meeting. So just highlighting a divergence of opinion, and probably an expectation that cuts will come if the economy remains strong, between now and their next meeting. And inflation, I think, is the main concern. That's the other piece to watch and make sure, or see if that trend that we highlighted last week, it continues or flattens or retreats. But it's kind of setting the stage, I think, for a cut of the short-term rate, in the coming meetings, even though it's not expected to to actually happen today.
Jeff, let's get more 30-year mortgage rates to 5% and never touch them again. Can we agree to do that?
Yeah, you have my buy-in. If we can just get ourselves appointed to the Fed board, that might be at least a first step. I'm not sure how close we are to that, though, Mark.
I don't know. Maybe a little ways to go, but anything's possible, Jeff. Well, I really enjoyed the time here. Great episode, and thanks for sourcing the wonderful guest, Mr. Fontana. Thank you for making it out and sharing the good, enthusiastic work you're doing to help real estate mortgage at large.
Boy, absolutely. It'll be fun to see the progress of that over time, kind of a mini Doge effort, as far as just rolling back regulations. So yeah, it's been a great conversation, Mark. We'll do our best to survive today. If we're back next week, that means we successfully completed the fast, but we'll plan on it.
Take care, Jeff.
Very good.